Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next panel for today, which we've entitled Winds of Change for Higher Learning, AI's Impact on Students and the Future of Industry. I don't know whether it's winds or cyclones, but I think we'd all agree that we're certainly going through significant change at the moment. I think this is going to be a fascinating session because we've got just such a great panel to contribute for us. So let me quickly just introduce everybody. We've got Dan Cockrell, who's the CEO of Torrens University, and Dan's got a really fascinating background, which we'll discuss as we go through this morning's panel. Ray Fleming, who a number of you I'm sure will know. Ray's an industry veteran who's worked for Microsoft and Google and is now very deeply ensconced in AI and all of the implications that has for education. So welcome, Ray. We're extremely lucky to have Professor Rose Luckham with us. Rose is a bit of a doyen in AI in education and has been sort of leading a lot of the research in this for a number of decades now, and we're very, very happy to have Rose with us. And we've also got David Kellerman, who some of you will probably know as well, and David's an associate professor at UNSW and has done some fascinating things with technology as well, which we will elaborate on as we go through the panel. So I don't think I need to go into too much detail around the change that's occurring in higher education. We're all aware of it. And we're also aware to varying degrees of the impact that AI is having, not just in reshaping education, but reshaping probably every aspect of our lives. And it's not just about tools as it used to be. It's fundamental change in the skills we need to develop and how they're recognised, how they're applied. So there is just so much to this, and we're going to try and pick this apart and make as much sense of it as we can in the next hour or so. So to start off, I'm going to ask each of our panelists, and I'll kick off with one myself, but for a single statistic or signal that to you best captures the state of the sector right now. And I'll give mine first, and mine's, I'm going to cheat, I'm going to give two statistics, and they are 2 and 10. What am I talking about? Well, I've picked out one of many examples I could have used. This is an AI startup that was founded in 2023 called Cognition, and it's developed a product called Devon. Now, 2 stands for $2 billion, which is its valuation. I think it's closer to 3 now. And 10 stands for the number of employees they have. Now, there is many examples of this. Why do I raise this? Because I think if you sit back and consider this, it is quite extraordinary on a number of levels. It's obviously extraordinary in terms of just what this technology is doing from a business startup and a business growth perspective. But also if you think about the fact that there is 10 employees driving a business that is valued at $3 billion. So from a efficiency perspective in terms of business models. And then of course you think about it from an educational perspective in terms of the implications for what do we need to be teaching students today who are going out into a world in which there are business models that simply did not exist only a few years ago. So that's my one example. I might hand over to Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So I'm going to break the rules too and do 2 statistics. I don't know if they're statistics necessarily, but they were actually, it's funny, you can just pick up the paper on any given day and get these. One of them I read was half of the US college graduates are in jobs that don't require a degree. So, kids are going to school, they're getting out, and they're seeing better opportunities outside of in other roles. And we'd call them vocational nature a lot of the time. But that idea of a prerequisite of a degree, as I'll state the obvious, as we all know, is going away quickly. And the other one I want to share was just today. I follow Andrew Norton very closely to help educate me about the sector here in Australia. And he had an article he was quoted as saying the median income of men in their 20s with a vocational qualification is higher than those with a bachelor's degree. Now, he does call out once you get to your 30s, the graduates catch up. But it's certainly a decision I think a lot of young people are making today when they look at the return on investment and value of a qualification, is there's other routes to take. So I think this is not just about how we're going to work AI into how we do things, but it's how AI is going to impact everything we do, and are we still relevant to students, and how do we keep changing? We've seen these throughout history, companies, technology changing, and companies and sectors holding on to the past, hoping it would go away, and it doesn't. And so really making some hard decisions is going to be key for those organizations that are going to survive moving forward.
Interesting. Absolutely. Who'd like to go next? Right?
Well, you said bring along a statistic or a signal. So I brought a signal, which has got 4 statistics behind it, but I just brought the signal, which is looking at from the outside. If I was looking at education as a venture capitalist at higher education, I would look at its core product lines and take a signal from that. And so I would look at the signal, which is that the proportion of year 12s that are going to higher education is going down. That's like #1 revenue stream. What are the other revenue streams? International students. Well, that's huge risk now, and either capped or going down. Research. We're in a world of pain around research funding, and that doesn't seem to be getting any better. What are the other product revenue streams, like MBAs? That's having difficulty, and I would guess PhDs as well. So if I was looking from the outside, the signal I would see is that every single revenue line for a university is either under pressure or at huge risk. That's a signal for change, I think.
Certainly is.
Mine kind of follows on from that, Michael. So shall I go next?
Of course.
Because I think, what are universities for? Well, part of it is for qualifications, isn't it? And if we look at my statistic, which is a third, or actually more accurately, more than a third of Australian university students have used a chatbot like ChatGPT for assistance with an assessment, and do not necessarily see this as being a breach of academic integrity. Now, that data was collected 2020, 2023, 2024. If I look at a comparison in the UK, we see that in 2024, it was 53%, an equivalent statistic, and it's up to 88% in 2025. So that third is likely to grow significantly. And I think it encapsulates a key dilemma that the higher education sector is facing. Universities are scrabbling around, trying to develop policies and detection tools, total waste of time, rather than addressing the fundamental issue around assessment, which is the desperate need for change, really key change into working out what it is we're trying to assess. Because let's face it, if a chatbot that doesn't understand anything, there's a lot of information that it can collate together, but doesn't actually understand the world, can pass the assessment, I think what we should be doing is saying, is that a valid assessment? So that's my statistic for you, which I think is a signal of one of the fundamental revenue streams for universities, Ray, has to be around people wanting qualifications. And of course, we've already heard that actually employers are not so keen on having a degree anymore. So yet another signal in that direction.
Well, that leaves me, a couple of years ago, we surveyed first-year students across the entire university. And one of the questions was, what's your main priority in first year? And another question was, what's your main priority throughout your degree? And the top answers respectively were 1, make a friend, and 2, get a job. And just to put into context, UNSW has got, or usually has, Australia's best graduate outcomes, which means we've got the best employability statistic. And we are an on-campus university, which means most of our programs expect you to be on our big monolithic campus. So for a university where you've generally got a really good chance of making friends and getting a job, we're seeing a signal that says our students are lonely and demoralized and unoptimistic about the workplace. And I think that's a general snapshot of the mentality of our Gen Z students at the moment, which is really something we need to lean into.
Yeah, interesting, fascinating. Thank you. I think it also raises the question about us thinking about how we've been serving our customers, or dare I say customers, over the years. And what's interesting is, you know, AI has certainly accelerated and exacerbated the challenges that we've just highlighted. But the reality is that a lot of them have been around for a long time. This isn't something new. So what I'd love your views on now is how you would rate the sector's response so far, and what do we need to do differently to make it possible for us to address this in a meaningful way. We'd like to kick off. Just another small question for a Tuesday morning.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at it. And I think for everyone's listening today, there are no right answers. This is there's lots of possibilities here, which is good and bad. There's no solution. It's just managing a dilemma, which is the best you can do. I think some of the obvious ones, you know, I don't think we need to be too cute about how we think about this. Relevance, right? And how are we relevant? How we rate today, I guess you could say there's some organizations that are moving quickly and others are never going to get there. They're just not designed from their history and their standards and how they operate. They're just not going to be able to get there. But clearly we need to have a value for people, and there has to be a relevance. And if we're starting to determine that degrees are less relevant, I don't think they're irrelevant, they're less relevant before, then we have to tap into what is relevant for the students. And I'll talk more about that in a minute in the next round of questions. I think this idea of understanding the students, you know, David, I think those are great. You know, you talk to your students and sometimes you hear things that are really simple. I want to get a job and make a friend. Wow. Okay. So that's, you know, I can think of 100 tactics in each of those areas, but it points me in the right direction. So I think a lot of times, and you know, I've worked in industries where we think we know what our customers, our students want, and we should never, ever lose sight of the fact we got to keep asking that question. Because we're experts, we stop asking because we know. And once we know, we're in big trouble because we don't know, and reaffirm those. So I think generally organizations like to say they're student-centric, customer-centric. They're putting themselves in students' or customer shoes. But I think a lot of organizations aren't close to that. And I know Torrens, we've had a reputation for doing that, but we have a long way to go to really get ourselves to a point where we truly understand real time what our students are dealing with and responding.
Who's next? Ray.
I'm happy to go.
Oh,
Ray, you go.
No, Rose, please go.
Okay, I was just thinking because it follows on, Dan, because you know, I was talking about assessment and the value of what you get from your university experience with respect to qualifications. Of course, there's a lot wider value that's really important. But I'd say that actually I'm underwhelmed by the sector's response. I'm not saying there's not some great stuff happening. Of course there is. But in general, I'd summarize it as it's either prohibitive, don't do it, conditional, lots of complex frameworks that I'm not sure how many people really understand, or permissive. You know, I was struck by University of Sydney, for example, allowing AI to be part of many of their assessments, although I also understand they're looking at bringing back much more in-person assessments, which may not be the best way forward. But I'm not seeing that real grasping of what the key challenge is here. And I think you're right, Dan, a lot of that is by making much more effort to understand what your customers really need and what they need for the world of work. And that does mean a radical shift in the way that we go about assessment. And I'm not seeing that. So I'd say that, bearing in mind that, universities are, full of highly intelligent people, I think we need quite a big shift in mindset to recognize the really radical change that's needed if universities are still going to have value in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years.
Okay, I'll have a crack at it. I think the response has been managing the negatives rather than grasping at the opportunities. And I think that comes from the background of where universities come from. I remember a vice chancellor talking about making their decisions on 10-year cycles. This organization has existed for 100 years, and we're thinking about the next 100 years, not the next 10. I come from organizations that operate in VUCA environments, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And now we're all operating in a VUCA world where our whole existence is in this thing. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow, but somehow you've got to start taking a step in a direction that is the right direction, because our students of today are going to go out into a world of work that hasn't yet been defined and that we cannot accurately predict, but we know which direction it's going to go in because there are enough signals. And so I think the sector has done what the sector is good at, which is, here's what we do today. What is the impact of this thing on this thing we do today? So it's looked at assessment. It's looked at the fact that there's a risk that students are going to switch their brain off because they're going to hand over things to ChatGPT to do. But it hasn't looked at the opportunity side, which is, what could we now do that we've never been able to do in the past? And it's unfair to pick on the higher education sector and say that the higher education sector is the only one that is like that, because I think a lot of businesses are like that as well. The difference, though, is in a regulated sector like higher education, an upstart can't come in and eat your lunch, whereas they can in the commercial space. But I think an upstart could come in and eat the lunch. It'll just be a university from a different part of the world or somebody with a very different mindset.
Well, that leaves me, and just to quote the question again, how would you rate the sector's response so far? My answer is fail. So I'm there with Rose. I don't think we've done a good job. I think we've been too reactive. And I think that we've forgotten about the extraordinary institution of the university, the civic role it plays, the place it holds in society, the ideas and the dreams that students have when they imagine this formative part of their lives of going to university. And I think we've been blown about like unanchored people who have forgotten who we are.
Brilliant. Thank you. And to your point, Ray, about upstarts won't come in and eat our lunch, we might come back to that towards the end of this conversation, because there's a strong argument to say that we actually need some of that disruptive innovation, because it's unlikely to come from incumbents, as it is unlikely to come from incumbents in any sector. So we'll come back to that one. All right, we're going to go to Dan now, and we've had a bit of an insight into Dan already, I think. But Dan, you are one of those rare beasts, and I'm glad you didn't take offence to me calling you that. Who comes from outside the higher ed sector and comes from the commercial sector. I'm really interested to understand how you think your commercial experience assists in the role that you now have, particularly in the context of what we just discussed.
Sure. First of all, there's a comment I want to make at the very beginning here, just with my accent. I moved here, my wife and I moved here from Colorado. I'd like to apologize on behalf of my country right now. And I'd like to think there's a temporary insanity happening, and well, hopefully things will get back to normal. So I'm as appalled as everyone else, but I don't want to talk politics here today. Yes, so some of these concepts are very simple, and it was music to my ears to hear Rose talk about the fact that maybe not everyone understands all the models, because I've been in some meetings when I thought maybe I just don't get it. And apparently others don't either when I talk to them candidly. So sometimes we try to just overcomplicate things. So, the sector I come from, which is 26 years with the Walt Disney Company. One of the things the Walt Disney Company did was simplify things and simplify the culture. And when I think about a place like Torrens or any other university, it's very much like a theme park or a hotel or a business. We have employees who are delivering a product or service to customers, and that's the same model wherever you go. Now, at the end of the day, our customers, our students, I've learned very quickly not to use the guest word or the customer word at a university, because boy, it's not. So I'm really setting down students, but I'm making my point. They have choices. Students have choices, and they have more choice than they ever had. It used to be a regional university. That's the only choice you had. Today, you can attend any university, many universities in the world, wherever you want to go. And so that competition is there, and it's going to become more because technology is going to keep being enhanced. And we already see that. We're all sitting in different parts of Australia right now, and people maybe are tuning in from all other countries, and that's what it's doing to us. So they have choices, and so we have to provide value. When I think about value, I don't try to decide what value is. Once again, going back to what do our students want, and the business environment I was brought up in, we call these key drivers. So key drivers, things are rated. There's a number one reason generally people go to universities. There's a number two, there's a number three, and it goes all the way down the list. And we can put resources and funding and focus on any of those. But at the end of the day, we all have limited resources, which is what makes our job so difficult. And so we have to prioritize what those resources are. And so coming back to David's point of surveying students, why are you here? What is the most important thing to you? Is it a degree? Is it getting a job, being employable? Is it having a great experience, a great life experience, or making a friend, or getting exposed to other cultures or nationalities? Is it flexibility? Because maybe you don't have the time to meet all the schedules of a university, but you still want an education. And so that is the same as it is in a theme park. In a theme park, the number one key driver is I want to go on new rides and attractions. Number two is I want people to be nice to me. Number three is I want things to be convenient. And those, you could replace that with anything at a university. So I think constantly learning what the priority needs to be and having the students define that for us, and then following up. Now, at the end of the day, the assessment model and all those things, that's up to us. We have to make sure that we are giving the students the right tools so they can be employable. Because if we make it too easy for them to get the answers, when they get the employers, they're not going to be able to do the job. And so it comes back on our reputations. But I think this idea of key drivers, we can't do everything. So let's hone in on the things that are most important, put most of our focus on those things. And at the end of the day, you'll get intent to return and intent to recommend, which is that's the lifeblood of every business, is people talking positively about the experience they have, possibly going back, and talking to friends and family and colleagues about their positive experience. So it's very relatable, I think, to any other commercial business.
Brilliant. When I joined the sector 9 years ago, you would not have had a conversation with anyone like that one, what you just said to us there. And I think the likes of yourself and Scott Pulsifer at Western Governors, who was ex-AWS, and if you think of Martin Bean, who came from the commercial sector, I think that perspective can only add and help us to improve and become more engaged and with our customers and students, and deliver better outcomes. Which brings me to the next question for you, Dan. And once again, if I think back at my experience at WSU when I came into the sector as the first Chief Student Experience Officer, and one thing that struck me was that ironically for an evidence-based learning institution, our evidence base was non-existent. We knew nothing about the experience. We didn't understand things like basic biobehavior. What were the factors that led a student to preference one university over the other? All of that basic stuff. We ended up building a very rich insights base and insights community, and then did data-driven response models and all sorts of neat stuff, which the commercial sector do. But typically, it's just not something that exists in the sector. It's starting to a bit more now. Torrens, you've just told us that you do it, but not as well as you would like to do it. Mm. Why is it do you think that it doesn't exist across the sector today? And where do you think the opportunity, particularly given AI, exists to actually lift the bar when it comes to understanding and responding to our students?
Sure. I would say maybe Torrens has the same advantage I do, is having a lot less experience in the education sector. At 10 years old, as our vice chancellor talks about, we don't have piles of books with all our policies and all our traditions and that get written down and are very hard to get changed. I think, first of all, the fact we don't receive any public funding. So at the end of the day, we have to be really good at what we do because we're not getting any help. We gotta make that revenue on our own and pay our taxes and do all that. So that puts us in a very clear position to value our students, because we know if there's no students, there's no mission. We can't do what we do. And so there's a clear understanding of that. I think because the way Torrens was created as a private for-profit institution, culturally, just it's embedded in the culture to be able to move quickly and to be able to change and let go of things that we adopted and move on to the next new thing without a lot of conversation about, once again, the traditions and rigor that goes beyond that, because we all get very emotional to the past, and that holds us back sometimes from making difficult decisions. And the good thing is when you have a environment like that where you're more non-traditional, you move quickly, you start to attract faculty and staff who thrive in that kind of culture, and want to be in a place like that because things get done. Things get done quickly. We don't always make the right decision, but we make it quickly, right? And we learn fast and move out of whatever decision we may have made a mistake in. So being able to take those risks, I think, is something that a lot of our staff and faculty feel comfortable with here. What will AI bring? I don't even want to pretend that I understand what that's going to do. And I could talk all day long about what it could be and what the dilemmas and the problems are with it and what the upside is. But I think Ray, mentioned this, is you can't get paralyzed. You have to make decisions. And it's so easy to keep looking at the data, looking at the environment, reading the articles, benchmarking, and being afraid to take that step. But the great thing is when you innovate and you make that first small step, you learn a ton. You learn really fast, and you're able to make that next step. And so that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned in my job is, and I do get paralyzed sometimes. I say, I don't have enough information. And what I've had to learn how to be comfortable with is, in this VUCA world that Ray mentioned, is there is going to be ambiguity, and you're probably only going to have 40% of the information. And sometimes actually flipping a coin is the way to make the call. At least you're getting out of the gate and doing something. And once you do something, you learn. You learn either the upside or the downside, and you make that next decision. So this is easier said than done, but I think that we have to start taking some risks, and we have to start educating our boards and those around us that if we don't take a step forward, everything's just going to pass us by. It'll be a long, slow death, which is never fun. And so, really having the courage to make those calls and sometimes make the wrong decisions, but learn.
As Scott Galloway says, strategy is really hard. And if what you're doing isn't really hard, that's probably not strategy. And
it's planning. Yeah. Planning's easy. Strategy is hard.
Spot on.
That's right.
So that's a great segue to go across to Dave, and particularly a reference to culture and innovation. I mean, for those of you who don't know, Dave's been a trailblazer in leveraging technology in higher education in really, really interesting ways. And if you have a chance, just go and search for the Microsoft, what was it called again, Dave? The
Inspire
conference, and where you see Dave presenting in front of tens of thousands of Microsoft employees about what he did at UNSW. So my question for you is, you did create a radically different learning environment. You are what I would affectionately call a pirate, and you managed to do it in one of our leading institutions. And let's face it, these institutions are typically risk averse, bureaucratic, everything we know about universities. So help us understand how the hell you managed to do what you managed to do, given all of that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's two parts to it, which is the mechanics of how you actually do it when there's bureaucracy and funding and compliance and culture? How do you actually physically do stuff in a gigantic 100,000 person institution? And the second part is, how do you come up with ideas? How do you actually approach things such that you can't sit anyone at a room and say, come up with a new idea about AI and it necessarily be a good idea. So the first part of the question, in terms of mechanics, is actually around building a track record where people trust you. You have to have a do to say ratio. You actually have to deliver on ideas, and when you come up with ideas, they have to be successful. So you start small, and then you get the backing to do the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one. And eventually you get to the point where you walk into an office and say, give me $2 million, I want to do a thing. And they go, okay. And that's pretty much where it was around one of my more recent projects, which was the digital teaching studio I built, which is basically like the inverse of a hybrid classroom. It's a almost completely automated digital first teaching space where the students in the room are more like a live audience, and the remote students are all digitally embodied in the space. There's a huge amount of augmented reality, spatial audio, AI-driven production technology, and we get literally more than 10 times the synchronous engagement in those classes organically, just because the experience is so good. The second part is, how do you actually, what is my mindset around coming up with ideas? And what I would say there is, and I hinted at it before, which is, we're universities and we often forget about what we are. We forget about the idea of this 1,000-year-old tradition. And I think, Ray's here, he used to work for Microsoft, and there was a good example 1 or 2 decades ago where Microsoft will get lots of FOMO, like Apple would make a phone and they'd try to make a phone, and Apple would make a tablet and they'd try to make it. And they were always trying to, Google would make a search engine, they'll try and make a search engine. They were always trying to do the things that the other big tech companies were going to do. And then one day it was like, they went, hang on a sec, we're Microsoft. We can do stuff that nobody else can compete with. And today, Microsoft are just as big as Apple. They're pretty much the same market cap, but they do really, really different things because they actually understand what they do best and what nobody else can compete with. So when we're universities, I think that we get the same like ADHD approach where we go, Google are doing certifications, these people are doing online stuff. We're always trying to have this excessively reactive approach. And if we go back, it's like Dan talking about, like, what do the students really want? You go and talk to a high school student, say, what do you imagine out of university? And they imagine that they're going to be on a campus holding a latte with a backpack, walking with friends, cramming all night for an exam, having this, going to a party. They're going to have this incredible 4-year experience where they're going to make friends for life. And then they spend a week trying to work out how to sign on to a degree through some horrific online portal, and then never go to class and don't make any friends and just sit at home in their bedroom clicking on a screen. So we don't deliver on this incredible piece of experience in life. So when I approach innovation and technology, I don't go, look what these guys did, quick, let's try and do that. I think, how can we use technology to solve the problems that are eroding that beautiful tradition and that idea and that place in society that university has? How can we use technology to actually recapture, reclaim it, solve all of the problems that technology is usually creating, not solving? And it's essentially an inverse mindset.
So that all makes a lot of sense. The reality is there's only one David Kellerman. So given everything we've talked about in terms of the need for universities to understand their students better, the need to move more quickly, to innovate, to differentiate, and so on and so forth, and then you talk about the fact that you need to kind of, you need to prove your bona fides and demonstrate that. How the hell do we do that in the current environment where the world's moving 1,000,000 miles an hour? And for anyone listening to this who has the ambition that you have, how do we actually deliver outside of unicorns like yourself?
I think part of the answer to that is that there's just a big global experiment that's going to happen. We've seen waves and waves of this. We've seen massive hype cycles over things like MOOCs, and then there's not going to be any university anymore. Everything's just going to be MOOCs, and then the MOOCs completely collapsed. And then we saw this huge hype cycle about nobody's going to need to go to university. We're all going to study online. And then AI happened and basically negated the academic integrity of every single online degree, and the whole thing sort of starting to collapse. So I think that there is a natural hype and fall cycle that has to happen. The question of how you do that as an individual, I think there's like the Kodak Leica example, which is right around when digital photography came out. There were two really big companies in photography, Kodak and Leica. And Kodak, if you look at their stock price, they basically tanked over 5 years and then went into liquidation. Leica, over those 5 years, transformed their business into digital photography, and their stock price actually doubled. They lent into to beautiful hardware, beautiful photography. They transformed film to digital, but they lent into what they did best, which was around photography being an art form and being something tactile and beautiful. So with universities, do we want to be Kodak and just be disrupted into irrelevance because you can get your online degree on LinkedIn Learning or YouTube University or Khan Academy? Or do we want to lean into that experience that students want, that people want in life around physicality and professional skills and collegiality? I think there is a mindset and an attitude, and I think that people are going to see it in that fall and the rise and fall cycle that happens.
Fantastic. And what better a segue than to pass to Rose. Rose, I read an article about AI a number of years ago now, where it quoted that wonderful quote out of Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises, where the protagonist is asked, how did you go bankrupt? 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. And it was used in the context of AI, which I think is just beautiful. And no one better to talk to that than you, Rose, who's been there over a long period of time. Aren't we going through a gradually, then suddenly? And what's your perspective on all of this?
Oh, that's such a good question, Michael. And I think, we've really got to get to grips with what's actually happening here. Now, I talk a lot about learning fast and acting more slowly. And I realize that might seem contradictory to what Dan has said about we've got to be responsive, we mustn't be paralyzed. We've got to, and I agree with that. But I think we have to do it with wisdom. And therefore, I think it has to be a focus on learning, which Dan, you also mentioned, and David too. And so I think one of the key things that is risking what's happening at the moment and making the possibility of, I think, quite catastrophic changes for the sector is that we're not really understanding the fundamentals of what's happening with AI and what's happening with generative AI in particular, which of course is only part of the story. It's just the new kid on the block, but it's what's grabbed everybody's attention. And it's certainly sophisticated and useful. But we've got to get to grips with the fact that you cannot detect it, okay? Because even the people building these models don't really know how they work. So how can you possibly detect it? It's not going to happen. It's not possible. Stop wasting your time and money. And detection isn't the key anyway. You're never going to control it. because the large tech companies are much bigger than all of you, and they are controlling what's happening here. We've moved from basic large language models to reasoning models to agentic workflows, and how many people really understand what's going on there. And as the agentic workflows take over, we become more and more distant from what the AI is doing, and there is less and less transparency. So forget control, forget stability, because that's gone too. You know, we haven't seen all of the disruption yet. I don't think the real change that results from the launch of generative AI into the world, which was really about giving sophisticated AI tools at scale to anybody with an internet connection and the motivation to give it a go. In the same way that when Jeff Bezos decided to sell books from his garage online, he transformed the business model to bring us online shopping, which we all take for granted now. I don't think we've seen that big disruption from AI. So no, forget stability. So what do you do? Because as Ray points out, there's a real opportunity here. But the only way you can really grasp that opportunity is to learn fast. And yes, break things, but break the things that are no longer fit for purpose. And I would say one of those is assessment, because assessment drives everything that we do in the education sector, doesn't it? And it's not delivering what's needed at the moment. It's not delivering for the students. It's not delivering for employees. It's not delivering for society. And as David wisely pointed out, universities have a societal role. So it's universities that have to lead the way in transforming the way that we provide learning and we evaluate the extent to which we have been successful in providing learning. So yeah, I do think it's a moment of radical change, and we have to behave differently if we're really going to grasp this moment and get the best out of it for, let's face it, our students, because that's what really matters here.
So that brings to mind, I hate to do this to you, Dan, but I used to quote with my teams, don't behave like Democrats, because they play by the rules and they lose. And, and I think there's a risk here that as a sector, we play by the rules and we lose, right? Which is kind of to your point, this tension around the world's, if we try and be puritanical about it, we end up with a Google Career Certificates kind of a scenario. Yep. Where industry just goes around you. So, you know, given everything we've said about the challenges of a sector that's traditionally moved slowly anyway, and is great at innovating and so on, how do we break that nexus? Because it's only going to speed up, I suspect, in the outside world.
Yeah, agreed. And you know, once again, I like going back to the wisdom some of our other speakers here have is, you know, Ray talked about eating our lunch. You know, I think when we sit here in Australia, we all think about the sector and we're competing against each other for domestic students and for international students. The reality is Australia is competing against the rest of the world on where students are going to make decisions, whether they're going to go to, you know, domestic students are going to go to universities in Australia, and whether internationals want to come here as a place where they're going to get flexibility, mobility, relevance, employment opportunities. You know, this is one of the hard parts when you're in a regulated industry. You have to keep telling the story and showing the model, and I guess I'll call it lobbying to make sure, because we are, I think, the second or third biggest export in Australia's education, and I see that that fact a lot. It's really important to the economy, and it's important to the future of the success of the country. And so I think somewhere along the line, not only do we need to be at our own universities really pushing the limit on how we do things, but educating those who are going to make the rules of engagement for us and making sure they understand that. And it's complicated, and it does move slowly, because just like us, government officials, risk is really difficult because you make unpopular decisions and they're very public. And people usually don't know you're right till much later. So you're called the person who is reckless until one day they say 10 years later, wow, that was a brilliant move. But it's kind of like artists. They're not famous until they die. So it's once again, it's a dilemma we're in here, but I think continuing to tell the story, bringing in a global perspective, and looking and showing what other countries are doing, because other countries that don't have to worry as much about regulation are going to go figure it out to get the best solutions possible. And
Absolutely.
there has to be some rules to the game, absolutely, and we have to make sure that we are, respected and governed, but not at the expense of becoming obsolete.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm conscious of time. I knew we needed 4 hours for this conversation, but we don't have it. Rose, just very quickly back to you, because I've heard you talk a lot about, I think you used the term something like thoughtful progression or something. How do you reconcile in your own mind when you've got the experience, you know that we should be thoughtful about this, and yet, to your point, we kind of need to throw away the rule book to some extent? How do you kind of reconcile those two? Tension?
Yeah, it is tension. I think we have to differentiate between responsiveness for the sake of responsiveness, which is what I think we've seen with the prohibitive approach, with making it all about students cheating, with thinking we can solve it simply with technology. Being blunt, that's a wind of change that leads to a tidal wave of stupidity. We need to be responsive, yes, but we need to be thoughtfully responsive. So it is about learning fast and really learning the fundamentals of what is going on here. I think that's the only way that we can really grasp this opportunity. And it is different. And what, Dan is pointing out, I think, are the real key differences that the sector is facing now. And the sector has to work together to decide how we're actually going to leverage this opportunity. Because as I say, the large technology companies are huge, and they are controlling the game at the moment. So it does need a concerted effort to really work out how we do get the best out of this for our students, which is what really matters.
Yes, well, that's a lovely segue now to Ray, actually. Is the sector working together? So, Ray, you've been in a unique position where you've worked for two of the biggest technology vendors within the sector for a long time, and then working for an AI fund, looking at investment in AI businesses. So, just thinking about that, firstly, observations you may have on the sector and how it operates and the implications for where we're at today. And if I can throw an additional thing, is just to Rose's point, how much of it is going to be solved at a sectoral level versus at innovation within institutions?
Yeah, really interesting questions. Hey, I am delighted that Rose has twice said AI detectors don't work, because we have been shouting that into the wind on the AI in Education podcast for the last year. Every single episode in 2024, we said it. And what I'm astounded at, I'm sure you're the same, Rose, is we all know it to be true, and yet there are still institutions that do it because they don't see any alternative. They know it's wrong, but they don't have an alternative, so they do it. So, so maybe AI is operating like an X-ray machine. Assessment was already broken. If you talk to students about, as I did as an employer, about assessment, group projects, if you hired students where you knew they didn't sit the exam because it turns out they didn't have the skills that the exam said that they did have. So assessment was broken. AI has been the X-ray machine that showed us where the break is. I think the learning model, the one and done learning model, which is, you graduate in 2025 and apparently that's going to see you for the rest of your life. That's not true. That's broken. So what could we do? Better customer focus. I mean, which university sits down and says, the number one goal of our students is for them to make friends in year one, and the number one goal is at the end of 3 years to get a job? They pay lip service to those things, but really when you get down to the people building the product is they want to be an engineer. I need to teach them all these engineering things. Sorry, Dave. But actually, I completely agree with it with engineers, because I don't want a 95% qualified engineer, because that 5% is probably holding the bridge up. So what could they do? Better customer focus, better product management. I know that there aren't product managers in most universities, but by God, there needs to be, because getting that fit for the market that is now changing, learning is probably going to turn into a subscription, because that is what the successful learning models are. That's where it's growing. And again, wouldn't it be fantastic to not celebrate losing a customer after 4 years at a graduation ceremony and instead having them as a lifelong customer? In terms of going forward, the biggest challenge, I think, is how do you scale innovation? Dave, with what he did at UNSW, was absolutely amazing. We've had a massive global reaction. I mean, Dave went all around the world telling people how to do it, but it never got scaled up within his home institution. Despite the amazing scores from students around the teaching experience, and I saw some of that data, and I was telling my daughter's friends, hey, have you thought about engineering? Only if you can get into Dave Kellerman's classes. But that never got scaled up. Never got scaled up. There was that institutional reluctance to do anything. So keep moving forward, do something with AI that moves forward, because if you're not moving forward, you're going backwards. Change the culture to get faster decision-making loops. And I totally agree with Dan. Flipping a coin is probably as productive as setting up a committee. In fact, it's way more productive because you'll learn more in the 3 months of having done something than you will from a committee talking about whether you could or could not do it. And probably the last thing is the lesson I learned from Microsoft. Microsoft was a culture that changed completely when Satya took over, when he said, I want Microsoft to be a learn-it-all organization, not a know-it-all organization. And I kind of think we're in the same situation in higher education. The know-it-all is put on a pedestal in higher education. The learn-it-all is put down at the bottom rung of a ladder, and it should probably be turned around.
Yep, the old culture consideration again. All right, well, I've done a very lousy job on facilitating this fabulous session because we've got a bunch of questions and we're quickly running out of time. So I'm going to ask you all for a speed response to this last question before we get to questions, and that is, if we look ahead, say 5 or 10 years, how do you think the role of the university or vocational provider will shift? What do we need to do to start getting ready for change? And I'm going to kick it off. I'm going to be a little bit controversial, and I'm going to suggest we need to open the market up and fund clean sheet startups who can provide disruptive innovation, because that's the only way you typically get disruptive innovation. And it doesn't mean the incumbents are out of business, but it can actually assist with the market and assist with incumbents. Who wants to go next? David?
Yeah, 2 parts. First is, I think that universities, just in terms of the actual general digital experience, are miles behind. We've got to stop trying to solve problems on our own, and we have to start working together as a sector better. We need to agree on rules. I mean, Michael, you're involved with the MortarCAPS project around building data standards. I think that actually as a sector, we need to work on elevating our entire platform. A rising tide lifts all boats. What's going to happen in the future? Ray talked about subscription model. Dan talked about Disneyland. They're totally different things, and I agree. If you look at the music industry, there was a moment where you could buy a CD for $29.95, or you could buy a digital MP3 version for $29.95. And then 10, 20 years later, it totally bifurcated to, we pay a few cents for a streaming service and we pay $1,000 to go and see our favorite artist at a concert live. AI'd this. Taylor Swift made $160 million last year off streaming, and she made $2.1 billion off going on tour. So if you want to talk about what's going to happen with the market, it's going to bifurcate. There's the low value digital version, high value physical experience.
Yep. And as an aside, have a look at Mark Ritson, the marketing professor, and his mini MBA platform. And someone told me how much money he's personally making out of that. It's quite extraordinary. So I think there's an interesting view into maybe the future. Okay, who wants to go next?
I can go if you like, Michael. So I've already said it, really. I think learn fast and break the things that don't work is what we have to do. And we have to remember that it's what doesn't work for our customers. our students, and that we are learning providers. And what does that mean? What does it really mean to provide learning for our students? And that's learning as a research community as well, not just learning for undergraduates. So I think it's focusing on what it is to be a learning provider and recognizing how that is changing and how much we need to really learn quickly about that change and be prepared to take some risks and to move away from a lot of the things that are holding back what we're doing, because we're steeped in this history and we find it really hard to break those very long held beliefs about what a university education should look like. They're no longer fit for purpose. So we have to shift.
So I'm going to add to what Dave and Rose said. I think this experience thing is a really important point, because we all have to hope to God that ASU are not successful. Their goal is 250 million students. I remember the first conference of vice chancellors when I arrived in Australia 15 years ago that I went to. They very confidently said, nobody is a risk to us because we own the qualification system. But at the same time, I read some research that 93% of the curriculum is truly international. It's not Australia specific. And so there is a risk that ASU hit their 250 million students goal. And if that happens, half of those will come from Australia. And then experience becomes really important.
Right. Dan?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to quote the Rolling Stones here. You don't always know what you want, but you get what you need. And so as I think about, students, they know what they want. They want to get a job. They want maybe an experience, that emotional connection, but they don't actually know what they need to get hired. And so I think one of the concepts is this becoming a talent sourcing agency, right? So universities joining with companies to say, what is it? What is the profile of an employee that you want? Tell us what that is, and we will make sure we build the curriculum around that and deliver them to you. And then assessment isn't an issue, because we're going to guarantee they have either the soft skills, the technical skills, whatever it is you're ordering, we'll make sure we get them there. We just are going to have to be better at getting students to decide earlier on what kind of jobs they want. This idea of going to university for 4 years to discover yourself, we're going to have to accelerate that process. And I think there's a way to do that in the right way with assessments and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, if we're preparing a product, which is a student that wants to be, have the value, we got to figure out what companies are going to want along the way, and that makes sure that's going to guarantee we're relevant, because companies will hire the people that they need with the skill sets they need. And if we can provide that, we'll be in a much better place.
Brilliant. What better way to finish off such a great discussion than a quote from the Rolling Stones? So just quickly going to the Q&A, we've got 2 minutes. There's a great question here, which we might finish on, from John Paul Posada. Thank you. Should we really be taking a business analysis perspective on higher education? What exactly is the growth model we are striving for? Are we trying to increase revenue and profit in HE? And I'll start that with my view on it. And I think that there is a misconception around what business is all about, and it's seen as being something negative. And I'm not here to sing the virtues of the commercial sector, but I think at the end of the day, what we are doing is we are trading in commerce. Students are investing in one of the biggest things that they were investing in their lives, and there's all of those dimensions at play that we've talked about. Who would like to have a go at maybe one of our academics? It'd be interesting to get because you'll probably get the answer you would expect from our commercial beasts. But Rose or Dave, do you want to have a?
I think
I'll just give a really quick version, which is just, I've mentioned a few times about universities not forgetting their civic role in society. And I think a lot of what students want to do is they want to attach their name to that reputation and that brand. They want to be part of that tradition. And so, that's how we do it. We don't go, here's a 6-week online degree in, solving climate change or something. It's like, no, you attach your name to an institution that's had a huge and sustained global impact.
Thank you. Rose?
I think that's a great answer. But I think, the moment we started charging students for their degree, we have to accept we became a business. You know, that's the reality of where we are. And we want to be the best business we possibly can. So we want to make sure that our customers, our students get what they really, really need. You know, what is going to set them up for a successful life? Yes, I agree, with David about the importance of the societal role for universities, but it's all part of that package, isn't it? And that package is now, without doubt, a commercial one. It doesn't mean it's not also a responsible one, but it is a commercial one, and I don't think we can get away from that. So we have to accept it.
Yeah. And the reality is we have to deal with something that we really haven't had to deal with historically, and that is this concept of market forces. And that's not going away. Wonderful. Well, thank you. Once again, I feel privileged to have such a fantastic panel assembled today, and I hope you've all enjoyed the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Very
Mike.
much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mike. Bye.
Thank you.